Dr. Alexander Wilson stood before the world, his mind a labyrinth of solutions, but his heart heavy with the burden of what he was about to propose. The world as humanity knew it was crumbling, quite literally, under the weight of resource depletion, pollution, and a rapidly deteriorating environment. Food production, once the cornerstone of civilization, was faltering. The soil was exhausted, crops no longer flourished, and food was becoming more and more scarce by the day. The global population continued to grow, yet there were fewer resources to sustain it. Desperation was setting in, and if humanity didn't adapt, extinction was a certainty. For decades, Dr. Wilson had tried to find a solution, throwing himself into research, scanning for ways to stretch the world's resources thin enough to avoid an outright collapse. But each approach had ultimately failed. Cloning crops had proven ineffective, genetically engineered superfoods could not withstand the ravages of climate change, and synthetic foods lacked the nutritional balance necessary to sustain humanity long-term. The solution, however, lay in something entirely unconventional, a breakthrough in biotechnology, an innovation that, if successful, could end the need for food entirely. For years, Dr. Wilson had been toiling in his lab, obsessed with the idea of creating an alternative to the traditional way humans sustained themselves. His thoughts had turned to the very foundation of life: energy. The energy we derived from food was not only inefficient, it was destructive. Dr. Wilson understood that the human body was designed to survive, but not to thrive. We were constantly fighting against the very processes that kept us alive. Dr. Wilson's theory was simple. If humanity could bypass the need for food entirely, they could eliminate the harmful byproducts of digestion. Free radicals and the oxidative damage they caused would no longer be a part of human existence. The body would no longer need to process food, and the aging process, along with the associated diseases, would cease to be a threat. The concept he and his team had developed was radical: a bioengineered device, an energy assimilator, capable of generating and converting energy from external sources directly into usable fuel for the body. It was a small implantable device that would harvest energy from the surrounding environment, light, electromagnetic waves, and even sound, and convert it into bioavailable energy that the body could use as if it had consumed food. As Dr. Wilson prepared to present this innovation to the global community, the urgency of his mission weighed heavily on him. He knew that the world was teetering on the brink of collapse. The scarcity of food was not just a problem, it was a ticking time bomb. Without this technology, the future would be a grim choice. People would fight over the last scraps of food, and society would descend into chaos, perhaps even cannibalism, as the only means of survival. "This is our last hope," Dr. Wilson began, addressing a room full of world leaders, scientists, and policymakers. "Without this technology, we will face a future where our very survival is at risk. We will either look to artificial means of feeding ourselves through genetic manipulation, synthetic food, or, far worse, we will turn to barbarism. Cannibalism will become an inevitability. The need for food, for digestion, and the waste it generates, free radicals, toxins, and the oxidative stress they cause, will destroy us." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the room. The world's food systems were failing. Climate change had decimated crops, water was running out, and with every passing day, the human population grew more dependent on dwindling supplies. If humanity did not find an answer to the crisis, the only possible solution would be a brutal, desperate struggle for survival. The implications of Dr. Wilson's technology were staggering. If the energy assimilator could be successfully implemented, humanity would be free from the need for food. No more overconsumption of resources, no more conflicts over land and crops. But more importantly, humans would no longer age in the same way. The body would no longer be subjected to the constant bombardment of free radicals produced by digestion. However, as he presented the technology, Dr. Wilson was keenly aware of the social and psychological implications. Food was more than just sustenance, it was the bedrock of human culture. People had gathered around tables for millennia, sharing meals that bonded them in ways words alone could never express. Food represented joy, celebration, and survival. The very thought of living without food seemed unthinkable to most. What would remain of the connections between people if eating no longer bound them together? Dr. Wilson's mind turned to the widespread protests he'd seen in the media. Religious groups decrying the device as a violation of divine design, food corporations lobbying against the invention in fear of losing billions. The question before us is not whether this technology will work, Dr. Wilson said, his voice heavy with the knowledge of its potential. The question is whether we, as a species, can let go of the things that no longer serve us. Food has been a cornerstone of our identity, our survival, and our culture. But we are facing a crisis, and we have to ask ourselves if we are willing to make the hard choice. The alternative is extinction. The world's leaders convened to discuss the proposal. Public opinion was divided, as expected. Many feared the societal implications. What would it mean for the agriculture industry? What about food culture? Could the human spirit truly survive without food? Others were more pragmatic, seeing the technology for what it was, a lifeline in a time of unprecedented crisis. Dr. Wilson watched as governments began to move forward with trials, implanting the first devices into volunteers. The Energy Assimilator was working. For the first time in history, humanity had a chance to survive beyond the limits of its own biology. But with the successes came the inevitable resistance. People began to question what it meant to be human without food. Would society change so radically that it would no longer resemble anything they knew? For years, humanity had been defined by the act of sharing food, of growing it, cultivating it, celebrating it. The first new foods were met with shock. Scientific communities hailed it as a miracle, while others regarded it as a dystopian nightmare. The global political stage was in upheaval, and public unrest mounted as countries rushed to control the means of this new technology. What would happen to the very essence of humanity, the need to nurture, to gather, to break bread? As the trials continued, more and more people embraced the change. Societies adapted, and new cultural norms arose. People began to gather not around meals, but around shared experiences, around ideas, around innovations. The energy assimilators became commonplace, embedded in the bodies of millions, granting them a future free from the chains of hunger. The earth, too, began to heal. Forests returned, watersheds replenished. The land, once scarred by the demands of agriculture, was allowed to recover. Humanity's impact on the planet, once devastating, began to reverse itself. But the victory was bittersweet. Dr. Wilson knew that humanity had come close to the edge. The future had been saved, but only by embracing a technology so radical, so far-reaching, that it had changed the very fabric of society. The dream of a future free from the need for food had come true, but it was a future that came at the cost of many old traditions and of something that was, in some ways, unquantifiable. In the end, humanity had no choice but to look to the future with open eyes. To survive, to thrive, they had to accept this new way of living. The technology had given them a future where hunger, disease, and physical decay were no longer inevitable. The world had been given a second chance. It would be a different world, even a more humane world, where wars would not be a method of slowing food sources' depletion. If you liked this story, please comment, like, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit the bell for upcoming videos. Until then, let your imagination run wild. We'll get there.